Hello and welcome to today's Verified Live. World leaders will be meeting in Paris, attempting to draw up more detailed plans to support a future ceasefire in the war in Ukraine and deliver what's been described as a just and lasting peace. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, said it must involve a force designed to deter Russia. However, it's unclear whether any nations barring the UK and France are prepared to commit providing peacekeepers on the ground. Under the plan, British and French defence chiefs will go to Ukraine to discuss how to deploy forces. President Macron pressed on what would happen if America decided not to contribute to the so-called coalition of the willing, said Europe would hope for the best and prepare for the worst. Well, Sir Keir says leaders discussed further sanctions against Russia. Ukraine's President Zelensky, who's there at that summit, restated his belief that Russia does not want any kind of peace, a sentiment echoed by many of the leaders at today's talks.
Undoubtedly, America is important, very important. And the decisions that America can demonstrate today can influence, can impact in real terms the end of the war and Putin's desire to do it, because he doesn't want it really. And he really wants to divide Europe and America. And that's exactly what Putin wants. It's Putin who wants it, and his Kremlin machinery has been working on it for more than 1 year, dividing, weakening Europe, dividing the European Union, dividing the United States of America, dividing the United States from within in terms of support for Ukraine or not supporting Ukraine. And therefore, that's his wish. We want America to be stronger.
Well, that was President Zelensky in the last hour. Earlier, we heard from the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, who said progress towards peace needed to be speeded up.
Russia is playing games, that Putin is back to his old playbook, and therefore the pressure needs to go on to Russia to get more seriously to the negotiating table and to have a framework or a deadline, if you like, for responding to what the Ukrainians have already put on the table and what the US is seeking to achieve in their initiative. So I think there's got to be a framework around that. Obviously, we'll discuss that with allies and with the US, but also, and this was a very strong resolve across the room, that now is not the time for pulling back or weakening on sanctions. On the contrary, now is the time for increasing sanctions on Russia to get them to the table, to these negotiations, to the hope of a ceasefire and a lasting and secure ceasefire that preserves the security and sovereignty of Ukraine.
Well, that was Sir Keir Starmer talking after the French President Emmanuel Macron. He spoke at length and he talked about the British and French delegation that is going to be sent to Ukraine to work on boosting the Ukrainian army once there is a ceasefire. He went on to say our target is clear, it's to achieve peace, and to do this we need to get Ukraine in the best possible place. Let's hear a little more.
Everyone around the table agreed that, number one, European members were much more united than before. They were more courageous, they were more determined, and more committed to defending the safety of Europeans on the continent. Based on this, we decided to strengthen, to boost our response as a way to better protect our continent, both taking into account everything that has been done, both in member states and at the EU level. In other words, we need to boost, to bolster our forces and our capabilities. In the defence industry, we also need to better prepare for the peace on the continent. We need to strengthen the cooperation between our defence industries and our armies in order to better work together.
Well, let's go live to Kyiv. James Landale is there for us. James, it was fascinating listening to all of those leaders through the course of the afternoon. This idea of sending a British and French delegation to go to Ukraine to work on boosting the Ukrainian army. They're calling it a reassurance force now, not a peacekeeping force. And it's interesting, they will need to liaise really closely in terms of what the Ukrainians themselves require from the Europeans. What sort of support?
Yeah, look, the whole idea from the get-go has always been not trying to reinforce Ukrainian armed forces. Look, if you think about it, you've got almost 1 million Ukrainians under arms at the moment. You've got an even bigger Russian army on the other side. 10, 20,000 European troops on the ground is not going to change that ratio in any way whatsoever. In other words, this force was never going to be some sort of active fighting force. It was there to do things that the Ukrainians needed help with. In other words, securing major infrastructure sites, certain key cities, perhaps having a border role on the border of Belarus, freeing up other Ukrainian forces to go to the front line, training, that kind of thing. So that's what the troops on the ground is going to be focused on. And it could well be well in the west of the country, away from the front line. The key thing about all of this force is going to be what happens in the air, what happens in the sea. Because the Ukrainians need an air force. They don't have an effective one at the moment. And so that's something the Europeans can provide. They can base them in Romania and Poland and places like that, flying regular sorties over Ukraine to establish a safe presence and a policing mechanism to again try and deter Russian attacks. Because the moment you can get some kind of control on the air, you can get rid of the drones and the missiles that fly over Kiev and other cities so regularly, and then you can bring some normality. Perhaps you could bring some airlines, passenger aircraft back to Ukraine, and suddenly the picture looks very different. Then you've got to look at the sea. You're going to have some shipping there to clear all the mines out of the way to allow shipping to go through much faster. At the moment, all the shipping has to hug the coast of the western coast of the Baltic Sea and other ships and things like that. Who's going to do that? When are they going to do that? That's what they're looking at the moment. The question, of course, is it seems to be taking quite a lot of time. President Zelensky today said very explicitly and publicly, there are many questions and not many answers. So I think they're still trying to find it hard to actually get the actual package together in a meaningful way. So I think we're going to continue to have a lot more conversations like they've had today in Paris.
And James, President Zelensky was asked a question by one of the reporters in the news conference that to get this force off the ground, we still have to have a US backstop, and there is absolutely no guarantee as we're talking now that that is coming. That is a fundamental problem here with all of these steps that we assume will go into place once the ceasefire is in place.
Yeah, absolutely right, Matthew. It's a catch-22 because on the one hand, some of the Europeans are saying, well, there's no point doing it if we don't have American support. But equally, the whole purpose of these conversations in Paris and elsewhere is for the Europeans to put together a big enough package so that Mr. Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron can go to the White House and speak to Donald Trump, say, right, look, Donald, you asked us, Europe, to step up, to do more to defend Europe, to defend our own backyard. We are doing that. We've put together this coalition of the willing. Are you willing, Donald Trump, to put the cherry on top of this military cake? Give us a little bit of air cover, a little bit of satellite cover, a little bit of intelligence cover that will be the backstop that will make this a really powerful deterrent reassurance force. And the problem is, you know, we've yet to see whether or not the Europeans have put together enough of a package to come close to trying to change minds in Washington. So that's the calculation here. You and I don't need to be convinced. The public don't need to be convinced. There's one man sitting in the Oval Office. He's the guy who needs to be convinced. And that's why I think there are still some question marks about whether the Europeans have got enough together yet to go to the Americans to present them with that package.
James, a twin final thought, because there was that exchange. He's done it a couple of times in the last 24 hours. He was asked about the US Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff, and again described him as a real estate man living in another world, a different reality. What's that all about? And he was also asked about why any peace negotiations are not directly done in Saudi Arabia, and his answer to that was Putin wants more war. He doesn't want to have direct talks.
Yeah, on that last point, President Zelensky made it pretty clear that he would, in principle, be happy to sit down and talk to the Russians face to face. But he said, in his view, the Russians aren't ready to do that simply because they're still prosecuting a war. I mean, it's really strange if you think about it. At the beginning of this war in 2022, there were face-to-face talks, literally sort of, you know, within weeks of the the start of the full-scale invasion, there were actual talks, some of them on the border with Belarus, some of them were in Turkey. I remember attending conferences in Antalya, in the southern coast of Turkey, where the Ukrainians and the Russians were sitting face to face. Now, at the moment, so it's not inconceivable, but at the moment the Russians seem unwilling to do it. They're much happier to talk to the Americans, not least because the Americans are giving them so many concessions. In terms of Mr. Witkoff, I think the point that Mr. Zelensky is making is saying, look, Mr. Witkoff is a real estate guy. He's used to sort of saying, well, this is the reality, this is the house, this is the building I want to sell you, this is how big it is, this is what it overlooks. Whereas he says he doesn't think that Mr. Witkoff is quite aware that in Ukraine right now, when you buy and sell a house, the first thing that people ask is, where's the bomb shelter?
James Landale live for us there in Kyiv. Thanks very much for all of that. Thank you.